The rain had been falling since before midnight on December 13th, 1989, a cold and unrelenting Florida drizzle that turned the dirt shoulders along Interstate 75 into ribbons of rust-colored mud. The temperature hovered at 47 degrees, unseasonably cold for Volusia County, and the fog rolling off the St. Johns River had reduced visibility to less than a quarter mile. At 6:47 a.m., a salvage yard worker named Johnny Fiorentino was walking along the tree line near the Daytona Beach exit, searching for car parts that truckers sometimes tossed from their cabs, when he noticed something pale against the dark scrub palmetto. He thought at first it was a mannequin, perhaps discarded from one of the adult novelty shops that dotted the I-75 corridor. But mannequins do not have open eyes, and mannequins do not have 9 bullet wounds in their torso, arranged in a pattern that forensic analysts would later describe as consistent with someone firing while walking in a slow circle around a prone victim. The body belonged to Richard Mallory, a 51-year-old electronics repair shop owner from Clearwater, and his wallet was missing. His 1977 Cadillac Coupe de Ville was missing, and his pants were pulled down around his ankles. The Volusia County Sheriff's Office ruled it a robbery homicide within the first hour. What they could not explain was the handwritten note found in Mallory's shirt pocket, smeared with rain but still legible, that read simply, "I'm sorry I couldn't be what you wanted. It's better this way." The handwriting did not match Richard Mallory's. It did not match any sample in the Florida criminal database, and the paper itself, when analyzed 3 weeks later, was traced to a motel notepad from a Best Western in Ocala, 68 miles north, where no guest matching Mallory's description had ever checked in. Before we continue, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The story of Aileen Carol Wuornos cannot be told without first understanding the geography that created her legend, and the geography that ultimately destroyed her. Interstate 75 runs like a severed artery through the center of Florida, connecting the sprawling suburbs of Tampa to the dense, humid forests of Ocala, and then northward through the forgotten towns of the I-75 corridor until it reaches the Georgia border. In 1989, this stretch of highway was a lawless expanse of truck stops, cheap motels, adult bookstores, and roadside bars that catered to a transient population of truckers, drifters, and men seeking services they could not find in their hometowns. The corridor was known among law enforcement as the Invisible Highway, a place where people disappeared without anyone noticing, where identities could be shed like snakeskin, and where a woman with a short temper and a .22 caliber pistol could operate for 13 months before anyone connected the bodies. Richard Mallory was not the first victim. He was simply the first victim to be found. The true story begins not in December of 1989, but in the spring of 1986, when a woman calling herself Susan Blahovec walked into the Last Resort bar on Harbor Oaks Drive in Port Orange, Florida. The Last Resort was exactly what its name suggested, a dim and smoky establishment where the jukebox played nothing recorded after 1979, and where the regulars nursed draft beers from noon until the 2 a.m. closing time. The bartender that night, a man named Louis Gazzo, would later tell investigators that Susan Blahovec carried herself like someone who had been in a fight recently, not that she bore visible bruises, but in the way she watched the door, the way she positioned herself with her back to the wall, the way she flinched when anyone approached from her blind side. She ordered a Budweiser and paid with crumpled singles that she pulled from the front pocket of her denim jacket. Her hands were calloused and her fingernails were bitten to the quick. Louis Gazzo estimated her age at somewhere between 30 and 45, that range of hard living where years become difficult to calculate. Susan Blahovec was, of course, a fiction. The woman sitting at that bar was Aileen Carol Wuornos, born February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan, a leap year baby, who would later claim that the calendar's refusal to acknowledge her birthday 3 out of every 4 years was proof that the universe itself did not want her to exist. Her father, Leo Dale Pittman, was a convicted child molester who hanged himself in a Kansas prison in 1969 when Aileen was 13 years old. Her mother, Diane Wuornos, had abandoned her and her older brother Keith to the care of their maternal grandparents when Aileen was 4 years old, and Aileen would not learn until adulthood that the people she called Mom and Dad were actually Laurie and Britta Wuornos, her grandparents, and that the woman she believed was her older sister was actually her mother. This revelation, delivered casually by an aunt during a family argument in 1971, was the first of many betrayals that would shape Aileen Wuornos into the woman who sat at the Last Resort bar that spring night in 1986, watching the door and calculating distances. The Wuornos household in Rochester, Michigan, was not a safe place for children. Laurie Wuornos was an alcoholic with a violent temper who beat Aileen with belt buckles and extension cords, leaving scars that would still be visible during her 1991 trial. Britta Wuornos was a passive enabler who retreated into silence whenever her husband's rages began. Keith Wuornos, Aileen's older brother and only true ally, was equally powerless to protect her. By the age of 11, Aileen had learned that the only currency she possessed was her body, and she had begun trading sexual favors to neighborhood boys in exchange for cigarettes and loose change. By 13, she was pregnant. The father was never identified with certainty, but Aileen would later claim in various interviews that the pregnancy resulted from a rape, possibly by a friend of her grandfather, possibly by her grandfather himself. The baby, a boy, was delivered at a home for unwed mothers in Detroit on March 23, 1971, and was immediately surrendered for adoption. Aileen never saw him. 3 months after giving birth, Britta Wuornos died of liver failure, and Laurie Wuornos, perhaps sensing that his abuse would no longer go unwitnessed, ordered Aileen and Keith out of the house. Aileen was 15 years old. She had no money, no skills, and no family willing to take her in. She began living in the woods near a local gravel pit, surviving on stolen food and the money she earned through prostitution. By 16, she had been arrested for the first time for disorderly conduct and drinking in public. By 17, she had drifted to Colorado, where she was arrested for firing a .22 caliber pistol at a vehicle from which she claimed a man had attempted to abduct her. The charges were eventually dropped. By 18, she had hitchhiked to Florida, drawn by the promise of warmth and the knowledge that Florida's highways offered an endless supply of men willing to pay for companionship. The next 15 years of Aileen Wuornos' life followed a pattern so consistent that investigators would later reconstruct it with remarkable precision. She worked the truck stops and rest areas along I-75, offering her services to long-haul truckers and traveling salesmen. She was arrested repeatedly for assault, weapons violations, forgery, and robbery. She served multiple short sentences in county jails throughout Florida, never more than a year at a time. She married a wealthy yacht club president named Louis Fell in 1976, a man more than 50 years her senior, but the marriage lasted only weeks before Fell obtained an annulment, claiming that Wuornos had beaten him with his own walking cane. She attempted suicide at least twice, once by wrist-cutting in a Daytona Beach motel room, once by overdose in a Tampa hospital parking lot. She was homeless more often than not, sleeping under highway overpasses and in abandoned vehicles. And then, in June of 1986, she met Tyria Moore. Tyria Moore was 24 years old, a former hotel maid from Cadiz, Ohio, who had moved to Florida seeking a new life far from the conservative small-town atmosphere of her hometown. She was soft-spoken, heavy-set, and profoundly lonely. She met Aileen Wuornos at a gay bar in Daytona Beach, and within weeks, the two women had moved in together, beginning a relationship that would last through the murders, through the investigation, through the arrest, and through the trial, ending only when Tyria Moore agreed to testify against her lover in exchange for immunity from prosecution. The nature of their relationship has been debated by true crime researchers for decades. Tyria Moore consistently maintained that she knew nothing of the murders until late 1990, that she believed Aileen's money came from prostitution, and that she was merely an innocent bystander who became trapped in a nightmare not of her making. Aileen Wuornos, by contrast, made contradictory statements throughout her incarceration, sometimes claiming that Moore was her partner in the crimes, sometimes insisting that Moore was entirely innocent, sometimes suggesting that Moore had been the driving force behind the killings and that Aileen herself was merely following orders. The truth, as with so many aspects of this case, likely exists somewhere in the uncertain territory between these competing narratives. What is beyond dispute is that Tyria Moore's entry into Aileen Wuornos's life coincided with a dramatic escalation in Wuornos's criminal activity. Before 1986, Wuornos had been a petty criminal, a woman who supplemented her prostitution income with theft and forgery, but who had never, so far as investigators could determine, crossed the line into serious violence. After 1986, something changed. The first concrete evidence of this change came on November 30th, 1989, 2 weeks before Richard Mallory's body was discovered, when a 1977 Cadillac Coupe de Ville, matching the description of Mallory's vehicle, was found abandoned in a wooded area near Ormond Beach. The car had been stripped of its license plates, and someone had made a clumsy attempt to wipe down the interior with what forensic analysis determined was a mixture of bleach and motor oil. But the car's previous owner had been a neat and careful man, and hidden in the recesses of the dashboard was a business card for Mallory Electronics, with Richard Mallory's name and Clearwater address printed in neat block letters. The Volusia County Sheriff's Office now had a name for their unidentified victim, and they had the beginning of a timeline. Richard Mallory had last been seen alive on November 30th, 1989, leaving his Clearwater shop at approximately 5:15 p.m. He had told his business partner, a man named Jackie Davis, that he was driving up to Daytona Beach for the evening, that he planned to visit some of the bars along the beachfront, and that he might not return until the following morning. Jackie Davis described Mallory as a man of regular habits who frequently made such trips, always alone, always returning by noon the next day. When Mallory failed to return on December 1st, Davis assumed he had extended his trip. When Mallory still had not returned by December 4th, Davis called the Clearwater Police Department to file a missing persons report. The report was entered into the system, cross-referenced with John Doe reports from surrounding counties, and forwarded to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement in Tallahassee. But the system was slow, and the connections were imperfect, and by the time Richard Mallory's name was matched to the body in Volusia County, 13 days had passed, and the rain had washed away whatever physical evidence might have remained at the scene. The investigation into Mallory's murder proceeded along two parallel tracks. The first track, pursued by Detective Larry Horzepa of the Volusia County Sheriff's Office, focused on Mallory's personal life and business dealings. Richard Mallory, Horzepa quickly learned, was not the respectable small business owner his obituary would describe. He had a lengthy criminal record in Maryland and California, including convictions for burglary and sexual battery. He had served 10 years in a Maryland psychiatric facility after being convicted of violent rape in 1957. He had been suspected, though never charged, in multiple sexual assaults in the Clearwater area throughout the 1980s. He frequented prostitutes along the I-75 corridor, and he was known among the working women of the truck stops as a man who liked to play rough, who sometimes refused to pay, and who had been the subject of multiple complaints to local police, complaints that were never seriously investigated because the complainants were themselves engaged in illegal activity. This information would become crucial to Aileen Wuornos's eventual defense, the foundation of her claim that she had killed Mallory in self-defense after he had raped and brutalized her in his car. But in December of 1989, it was merely one piece of a puzzle that did not yet have a coherent shape. a detail that suggested Richard Mallory might have made many enemies in his 51 years, any one of whom might have had reason to want him dead. The second track of the investigation focused on the mechanics of the crime itself. The .22 caliber bullets recovered from Mallory's body were a common type, sold at thousands of sporting goods stores across Florida. The trajectory analysis suggested the shooter had been standing, firing downward at a victim who was lying on the ground, possibly already wounded, possibly restrained. The absence of defensive wounds on Mallory's hands and forearms suggested he had been incapacitated or surprised before the fatal shots were fired. The positioning of his body, face down with his pants around his ankles, suggested either a sexual component to the crime or a deliberate staging intended to humiliate the victim. The handwritten note remained unexplained. 6 weeks passed. The investigation stalled, and then, on February 1st, 1990, another body was found. David Spears was a 43-year-old construction worker from Winter Garden, Florida, a divorced father of 2, who had last been seen on May 19, 1989, leaving a construction site in Tampa with a cooler of beer and a plan to drive up to Gainesville to visit his ex-wife. His body was found along U.S. Highway 19 in Citrus County, 64 miles from where Richard Mallory had been discovered. He had been shot 6 times with what ballistics analysis confirmed was the same .22 caliber weapon. His truck, a 1988 Chevy, was found 3 days later near the I-75 exit in Homosassa Springs. His wallet was missing. His clothing was in disarray. And, like Richard Mallory, he had a reputation among his co-workers as a man who frequented prostitutes during his long drives across central Florida. The connection between the 2 murders was not immediately apparent to investigators because the cases were handled by different jurisdictions. Volusia County had Richard Mallory. Citrus County had David Spears. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement, which was supposed to coordinate information between counties, was understaffed and overwhelmed, and the connection between the 2 .22 caliber shootings was not flagged until March of 1990, by which time 2 more bodies had been discovered. Charles Cascadden was a part-time rodeo worker from Missouri who had been traveling through Florida on his way to a new job in Tampa. His body was found on June 6, 1990, in a wooded area near Interstate 75 in Pasco County. He had been shot 9 times with a .22 caliber weapon. His vehicle, a 1975 Cadillac, was found abandoned the following week near the Suwannee River. His personal belongings, including a .45 caliber automatic pistol he carried for protection, were missing. Peter Seams was a 65-year-old retired merchant seaman from Jupiter, Florida, who had disappeared on June 7, 1990, while driving to New Jersey to visit relatives. His body was never found. His car, a 1988 Pontiac Sunbird, was discovered on July 4, 1990, after it crashed through a fence in Orange Springs, Florida. 2 women were seen fleeing the scene on foot. Witnesses described one as blonde, in her mid-30s, with a hard face and a limping gait. The other was described as heavyset, with dark hair and a frightened expression. A bloody palm print was recovered from the interior of the vehicle. The print did not match Peter Seams. The print did not match any suspect in the Florida criminal database. But the print would eventually match Aileen Carol Wuornos, once investigators knew her name. The pattern was now undeniable. Someone was hunting men along the Florida highways, targeting middle-aged men who traveled alone. Men whose vehicles could be stolen and whose wallets could be emptied. Men whose bodies could be dumped in the endless miles of scrub forest that lined the I-75 corridor. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement formed a multi-agency task force in August of 1990, bringing together investigators from Volusia, Marion, Citrus, Pasco, and Dixie counties. The task force was led by Captain Steve Binegar of the Marion County Sheriff's Office, a 20-year veteran who had investigated dozens of highway murders, but had never encountered a pattern quite like this one. The killer, Binagar believed, was almost certainly a woman. The witness descriptions from the Peter Seams car crash pointed to two women, one blonde and one dark-haired. The method of operation suggested someone who could approach male victims without raising suspicion, someone who could get close enough to fire multiple shots before the victim could react or defend himself. The staging of the crime scenes, with the victims' pants pulled down and their bodies positioned in sexually suggestive poses, suggested either a sexual motive or a deliberate attempt to mislead investigators into believing the murders were the work of a male homosexual predator. But the most compelling evidence came from the survivors. Because Aileen Wuornos had not killed everyone who encountered her along the Florida highways. She had let some men go. She had robbed them, threatened them, sometimes beaten them, but she had not killed them. And as the task force began canvassing the truck stops and rest areas along I-75, asking about violent incidents involving women, the names began to emerge. In September of 1990, an undercover investigator posing as a trucker struck up a conversation with a woman at a rest stop near Wildwood, Florida. The woman, who introduced herself as Lee, offered to provide sexual services in exchange for money. When the investigator declined, the woman became agitated and aggressive, demanding to know if he was a cop, reaching toward her waistband in a gesture the investigator interpreted as reaching for a weapon. The investigator withdrew and reported the encounter to the task force. In October of 1990, a bartender at the Last Resort in Port Orange provided investigators with a photograph. The photograph showed two women sitting at the bar, their arms around each other, smiling for the camera. The bartender identified them as Lee and Ty, regulars who had been coming to the bar for several years. Lee was blonde, loud, and often intoxicated. Ty was quiet, rarely spoke, and seemed uncomfortable in social situations. The two women, the bartender said, were clearly in a relationship, and Lee was fiercely protective of Ty, having started multiple fights with anyone who looked at her partner the wrong way. The photograph was compared to the witness descriptions from the Peter Seams car crash. The match was close enough that investigators obtained a warrant for the fingerprints of both women, though they did not yet have names. The break in the case came on November 19, 1990, when a pawn shop owner in Daytona Beach contacted the task force with information about a camera. The camera was a Minolta 35mm, and the pawn shop owner had purchased it several weeks earlier from a blonde woman who gave her name as Cammy Marsh Green. The camera's serial number matched a camera that had been reported stolen from the vehicle of Charles Carskadden, the rodeo worker killed in June. The pawn shop owner had required a thumbprint from the seller, standard practice for Florida pawn shops, and that thumbprint was now in the possession of the Marion County Sheriff's Office. The thumbprint was run through the Florida criminal database. The match came back within hours. The print belonged to Aileen Carol Wuornos, also known as Susan Blahovich, also known as Cammy Marsh Green, also known by at least 6 other aliases. She had a criminal record spanning 23 years and 7 states. She had last known addresses in Daytona Beach, Port Orange, and Holly Hill. She had a long-term romantic partner named Tyria Moore. The task force now had names, faces, and addresses. What they did not have was physical evidence directly linking Aileen Wuornos to the murders. The thumbprint proved only that Wuornos had pawned stolen property, a felony, but not a capital crime. The witness descriptions placed her near the Peter Seams crash site, but did not prove she had killed anyone. The ballistic evidence linked the murders to a single weapon, but that weapon had not been recovered. To build a case that could survive trial, the task force needed either a confession, an eyewitness, or physical evidence placing Wuornos at one of the murder scenes. They decided to pursue all 3 simultaneously. On January 5, 1991, Tyria Moore was located at her sister's home in Pittston, Pennsylvania, where she had fled several weeks earlier, apparently sensing that the investigation was closing in. Moore was approached by investigators and offered a deal: full immunity from prosecution in exchange for her cooperation in obtaining a confession from Aileen Wuornos. Moore agreed immediately. She would later tell reporters that she had known for months that Aileen was killing people, that she had seen the stolen property accumulating in their motel rooms, that she had heard Aileen come home at odd hours with blood on her clothing and wild stories about fights with men who had tried to hurt her. She had said nothing because she was afraid, because she loved Aileen, because she did not know what else to do. The cooperation agreement required Moore to make a series of telephone calls to Aileen Wuornos, calls that would be recorded by investigators. In these calls, Moore was to express fear that she would be arrested, to plead with Wuornos to clear her name, to pressure Wuornos into confessing so that Moore would not be charged as an accomplice. The strategy was legally and ethically questionable, a form of manipulation that defense attorneys would later challenge as coercive and unreliable. But it worked. On January 9, 1991, Aileen Wuornos was arrested outside the Last Resort bar in Port Orange on an outstanding warrant for carrying a concealed weapon. She was transported to the Volusia County Jail and placed in a holding cell. Over the next 3 days, she received multiple telephone calls from Tyria Moore, calls in which Moore sobbed, pleaded, and insisted that she could not bear the thought of going to prison for crimes she did not commit. On January 16, 1991, Aileen Wuornos asked to speak with investigators. She was read her Miranda rights. She waived them. And over the next 6 hours, she confessed to the murders of Richard Mallory, David Spears, Charles Carskadden, Peter Seams, Troy Barris, Charles Humphreys, and Walter Gino Antonio. 7 men, 7 murders, 13 months of killing along the Florida highways. But the confession was not the straightforward admission of guilt that prosecutors had hoped for. It was, instead, a narrative of self-defense, a story in which Aileen Wuornos was the victim rather than the perpetrator, a woman who had killed only to save her own life. The first man, Richard Mallory, had picked her up on the highway near Daytona Beach. He had seemed friendly at first, offering her beer and conversation, but as they drove deeper into the scrub forest, his demeanor had changed. He had become aggressive, demanding, violent. He had pulled off onto a dirt road and attacked her, tearing her clothing, binding her hands, raping her repeatedly over the course of several hours. When he finally released her, she had managed to retrieve a gun from her bag and shoot him. She had shot him 9 times because she wanted to make sure he was dead, because she was terrified he would recover and come after her, because she did not know what else to do. The second man, David Spears, had picked her up near Tampa. He had been drinking heavily and had become sexually aggressive. When she refused his advances, he had attacked her. She had defended herself with the same gun. The third man, Charles Carskadden, had seemed nice enough until he pulled off the highway and demanded sex at gunpoint. She had been carrying her own gun that day, and she had been faster. The pattern continued through all 7 victims. Each man had attacked her first. Each killing had been necessary for her survival. She was not a serial killer, she insisted. She was a survivor of male violence who had finally stopped being a victim. Investigators were skeptical. The crime scenes did not match her narrative. The victims had been shot multiple times, often from distances and angles inconsistent with close quarters self-defense. Several victims had been shot in the back. The staging of the bodies, with pants pulled down and positioned in humiliating poses, suggested rage and contempt rather than fear. And the consistency of the method, the same gun, the same caliber, the same pattern of robbery following murder, suggested premeditation rather than spontaneous self-defense. But there was one element of her story that investigators could not immediately dismiss. Richard Mallory, the first victim, did have a history of sexual violence. He had spent 10 years in a psychiatric facility for violent rape. He had been suspected in multiple sexual assaults in the years before his death. It was at least plausible that he had attacked Aileen Wuornos, that she had killed him in genuine self-defense, and that the subsequent killings had followed a different logic, perhaps a spiral into violence that began with a justified killing and progressed into murder. This question, whether the first killing was self-defense and the subsequent killings were murder, or whether all 7 killings were murder, or whether all 7 killings were self-defense, would become the central controversy of Aileen Wuornos' trial and would continue to divide researchers and true crime enthusiasts for decades after her execution. The trial of Aileen Carol Wuornos began on January 13, 1992, in DeLand, Florida. The prosecution was led by State Attorney John Tanner and Assistant State Attorney David Damore. The defense was led by public defenders Tricia Jenkins and William Miller. The charges were limited to the murder of Richard Mallory, with prosecutors reserving the right to try Wuornos separately for the remaining 6 murders if necessary. The prosecution's case was straightforward and devastating. They presented ballistic evidence linking the bullets recovered from Richard Mallory's body to a .22 caliber pistol that had been recovered from a creek near Aileen Wuornos' last known residence. A pistol whose serial number had been partially filed off, but which forensic technicians had managed to restore through acid etching. They presented the pawnshop records, showing that Wuornos had sold property belonging to multiple murder victims, including Mallory's camera and Carskadden's tools. They presented the bloody palm print from Peter Siems's vehicle, matched definitively to Aileen Wuornos through expert analysis. They presented the testimony of Tyria Moore, who described in detail the accumulation of stolen property in their shared motel rooms, the blood-stained clothing, the cash that appeared from nowhere, the late-night arrivals and evasive explanations. Moore's testimony was particularly damaging because she presented herself as an innocent bystander, a woman who had loved Aileen Wuornos, but who had been too frightened to confront her about the crimes she obviously was committing. She wept on the stand. She described her terror when she realized what Aileen had been doing. She explained that she had fled to Pennsylvania because she could no longer bear the weight of the secret, that she had cooperated with investigators because she wanted to clear her conscience and prevent further killings. Under cross-examination, defense attorneys pressed Moore on her knowledge of the crimes and her potential complicity. Had she benefited from the stolen property? Yes. She admitted she had worn clothing that Aileen brought home, had used electronics that appeared in their room, had spent money whose source she did not question. Had she ever confronted Aileen about the source of this property? No, she had been too afraid. Had she ever considered going to the police before investigators contacted her? No, she had not known what to do. The defense attempted to portray Moore as an accomplice who had escaped justice through her willingness to betray her partner, a woman whose immunity deal had purchased her freedom at the cost of Aileen Wuornos' life. But the prosecution countered that there was no physical evidence linking Moore to any of the murder scenes, that no witness had ever seen Moore with any of the victims, and that Moore's testimony was corroborated by abundant independent evidence. The heart of the defense case was Aileen Wuornos herself. Against the advice of her attorneys, she insisted on testifying in her own defense, determined to tell the jury her story of self-defense and survival. Her testimony lasted nearly 2 days. She described her childhood in Michigan, the abuse she had suffered at the hands of her grandfather, the rape that had resulted in her teenage pregnancy, the abandonment and homelessness that had followed. She described her years on the Florida highways, the constant threat of violence from the men who picked her up, the countless times she had been beaten, robbed, raped, or left stranded in remote locations. She described the night she met Richard Mallory, his charm and friendliness giving way to violence, his rape of her in the front seat of his Cadillac, her desperate struggle for survival. She was an effective witness in some ways, conveying genuine emotion and detail that suggested she was drawing from real experience. Her descriptions of sexual assault were vivid and specific, the kind of details that suggest personal knowledge rather than invention. Her account of her childhood abuse was corroborated by family members and social workers who had documented the Wuornos household's dysfunction decades earlier. Her claim that Richard Mallory had a history of sexual violence was not only accurate, but had been deliberately concealed by prosecutors who were legally required to disclose exculpatory evidence, but who had failed to inform the defense of Mallory's 10-year commitment to a psychiatric facility for rape. This prosecutorial misconduct would later become a significant issue in Wuornos's appeals, with defense attorneys arguing that knowledge of Mallory's criminal history might have influenced the jury to credit her self-defense claim. But the Florida Supreme Court ultimately ruled that the misconduct, while improper, was not prejudicial enough to warrant a new trial, given the overwhelming evidence of guilt in the other 6 murders. Because it was the other 6 murders that destroyed Aileen Wuornos's credibility on the stand. Under cross-examination, prosecutor John Tanner walked her through each killing, forcing her to repeat her claim that every single victim had attacked her first, that every single shooting had been necessary for her survival. Was it really plausible, Tanner asked, that 7 different men, encountered over 13 months on Florida highways, had all independently decided to rape and brutalize the same woman? Was it merely coincidence that each of these men had been carrying cash and valuables that Wuornos happened to take after defending herself? Was it self-defense when Charles Carskadden was shot in the back? Was it self-defense when Troy Burris, a sausage delivery driver with no criminal history and a reputation for gentleness, was shot 6 times and left face down in a ditch? Wuornos's responses became increasingly agitated and inconsistent. She insisted that all 7 men had attacked her. She claimed that she could tell when a man intended to rape her by the way he looked at her, the way he spoke to her, the way he drove. She said that the men of Florida's highways were predators who targeted vulnerable women, that she had been victimized hundreds of times before she finally decided to fight back, that the 7 men she killed were simply the ones who had pushed her too far. Tanner pressed her on the timeline. If she had been defending herself against rapists, why had she continued to work the highways after the first killing? Why not stop, find legitimate employment, leave Florida entirely? Wuornos explained that she needed money, that she had no other skills, that Tyria Moore depended on her income. But this explanation undercut her self-defense claim, suggesting that the killings were tied to robbery rather than survival, that she was choosing to put herself in situations where she would encounter potential victims. The most damaging moment of Wuornos's cross-examination came when Tanner asked about Peter Seams, the retired merchant seaman whose body had never been found. If Seams had attacked her, if she had killed him in self-defense, where was his body? Wuornos could not answer. She stammered, contradicted herself, finally admitted that she could not remember exactly what had happened to Seams's body. Tanner suggested that the reason she could not remember was that Seams's killing had not fit her self-defense narrative, that she had disposed of his body more carefully than the others, because something about that murder would have revealed the truth about her motives. Wuornos denied this, but her denial was unconvincing. The jury could see her struggling to maintain her composure, could see the anger and frustration boiling beneath the surface. And when Tanner asked her, finally, if she hated men, if she had killed these 7 men because she wanted revenge against the gender that had abused her throughout her life, Wuornos's response was chilling. She said that she did not hate all men. She said that she hated the kind of men who picked up women on the highways, the kind of men who thought they could buy a woman's body and do whatever they wanted with it. The kind of men who believed that a prostitute could not be raped because she had already consented to sex in exchange for money. Those men, she said, deserved whatever happened to them. The prosecution rested its case. The defense rested its case. And on January 27, 1992, after less than 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. The penalty phase followed immediately, with the same jury considering whether Aileen Wuornos should be sentenced to death or to life in prison. The prosecution's penalty phase case was brief and focused. They presented victim impact statements from the families of Richard Mallory's friends and associates, describing the pain and loss caused by his murder. They argued that the crime was heinous, atrocious, and cruel, meeting the statutory requirements for the death penalty under Florida law. They reminded the jury of the other 6 victims, the pattern of predatory behavior, the defendant's lack of remorse. The defense's penalty phase case attempted to present Aileen Wuornos as a victim of circumstances beyond her control, a woman whose abusive childhood, mental illness, and desperate poverty had led her to violence. They called expert witnesses who testified about the psychological effects of childhood trauma, the neurological damage caused by fetal alcohol exposure, the ways in which repeated victimization can lead to defensive hypervigilance and violent reactions to perceived threats. They argued that Wuornos was not evil, but broken, that she needed treatment rather than execution, that killing her would not bring back the dead, but would only add another victim to the toll. Aileen Wuornos herself spoke during the penalty phase, offering a rambling and sometimes incoherent statement in which she alternated between apologizing for the pain she had caused and insisting that she had done nothing wrong, that she had only defended herself against men who wanted to hurt her. She asked the jury to understand what it was like to live as she had lived, to be abandoned and abused and raped and beaten until violence became the only language she understood. She said that she did not want to die, but that she was not afraid of death, that death would be a relief from the endless suffering of her existence. The jury deliberated for less than 90 minutes. They recommended the death penalty by a vote of 12-0. Judge Uriel Blount formally sentenced Aileen Carol Wuornos to death on January 31st, 1992, pronouncing the sentence with the ritualistic language required by Florida law. Wuornos showed little reaction. She had expected this outcome. She had, in some ways, seemed to welcome it. Over the following months, Wuornos pleaded guilty to the remaining 6 murders, receiving death sentences in each case. She waived her right to trial in several of the cases, explaining that she saw no point in prolonging the proceedings when the outcome was inevitable. By the end of 1992, she was the most prolific female serial killer in American history, with 7 confirmed victims and possibly more whose bodies had never been discovered. The appeals process that followed Wuornos's conviction stretched across more than a decade and generated thousands of pages of legal documents, expert testimony, and judicial opinions. Her attorneys raised numerous challenges to her convictions and sentences, arguing prosecutorial misconduct in the failure to disclose Richard Mallory's criminal history, ineffective assistance of counsel in the trial attorney's failure to adequately investigate her background, judicial bias in the trial court's rulings on evidence and procedure, and constitutional violations in the immunity agreement with Tyria Moore. Some of these claims had merit. The prosecutors had indeed failed to disclose Mallory's history of sexual violence, a violation of their legal and ethical obligations. The trial attorneys had indeed conducted a minimal investigation into Wuornos's background, failing to locate witnesses who could have corroborated her claims of childhood abuse. The trial judge had indeed made several rulings that favored the prosecution, though these rulings were arguably within his discretion. But the Florida courts consistently ruled that none of these errors, individually or collectively, were sufficient to warrant reversal of Wuornos's convictions or sentences. The evidence of guilt was overwhelming. The aggravating factors supporting the death penalty were substantial, and Wuornos herself had confessed, repeatedly and in detail, to all 7 murders. More significantly, Wuornos herself repeatedly undermined her own appeals. She fired multiple attorneys, claiming they were part of a conspiracy against her. She gave interviews to journalists in which she contradicted her trial testimony, sometimes claiming that the killings were indeed murders rather than self-defense, sometimes insisting that she had acted in self-defense but had lied about the details to protect Tyria Moore. She became increasingly paranoid and unstable, claiming that prison officials were poisoning her food, that visitors were secretly recording her conversations, that the entire legal system was controlled by forces determined to silence her. In 2001, after more than 9 years on death row, Aileen Wuornos announced that she was waiving all further appeals and requesting immediate execution. She told the Florida Supreme Court that she was tired of waiting, that she wanted to die, that the prison conditions had become unbearable, and that she had nothing left to live for. She also claimed that she had killed in cold blood, not in self-defense, and that she would kill again if given the opportunity. This statement created a legal and ethical dilemma for the Florida courts. Wuornos appeared to be competent to make decisions about her own representation, but her statements were erratic and contradictory, raising questions about her mental state. If she was mentally ill, could she legally waive her appeals? If she was competent, should the courts honor her request even if it seemed motivated by suicidal despair rather than rational calculation? The Florida Supreme Court appointed a psychiatrist to evaluate Wuornos's competency. The psychiatrist, Dr. Harry Kropp, conducted extensive interviews with Wuornos and reviewed her medical and psychiatric records. His conclusion was that Wuornos suffered from borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder, conditions that affected her judgment and impulse control, but did not render her legally incompetent. She understood that she had been convicted of murder, that she had been sentenced to death, and that waiving her appeals would result in her execution. She was making a rational choice, even if it was a choice driven by mental illness and despair. Based on this evaluation, the Florida Supreme Court allowed Wuornos to waive her appeals. Governor Jeb Bush signed a death warrant scheduling her execution for October 9, 2002. In the final weeks before her execution, Aileen Wuornos gave a series of interviews to journalists and filmmakers, interviews that remain among the most disturbing documents in the annals of American true crime. She ranted about conspiracies, about sonic pressure devices in her cell, about plans to harvest her organs. She claimed that she had been controlled by radio waves, that the police had deliberately allowed her to kill so that they could create a media sensation, that her entire life had been a scripted entertainment designed for the amusement of invisible watchers. She also, in calmer moments, reflected on her childhood, her relationships, and the choices that had led her to death row. One of the most revealing of these interviews was conducted by documentary filmmaker Nick Broomfield, who had been following Wuornos's case since her arrest. In his 2003 documentary, Aileen, Life and Death of a Serial Killer, Broomfield captured Wuornos in her final days, oscillating between rage and resignation, between grandiose claims and heartbreaking vulnerability. At one point, she looked directly into the camera and said, "I'm one who seriously hates human life and would kill again." At another point, she broke down in tears and said, "I just wanted someone to love me. That's all I ever wanted." The execution of Aileen Carol Wuornos took place at the Florida State Prison in Starkey on October 9, 2002. She was 56 years old. She had spent more than 11 years on death row. In her final statement, she quoted from the science fiction film Independence Day, saying, "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus, June 6th, like the movie. Big mothership and all. I'll be back." The witnesses to the execution included representatives of the victims' families, corrections officials, journalists, and Wuornos's attorney. The lethal injection was administered at 9:30 a.m. Wuornos was pronounced dead at 9:47 a.m. Her body was cremated, and her ashes were scattered by a childhood friend in Michigan in accordance with her wishes. The execution of Aileen Wuornos brought closure to the legal proceedings, but opened new chapters of controversy and interpretation that continue to this day. She became, in death, a symbol whose meaning shifted depending on who was doing the interpreting. For some, she was simply a serial killer, a predator who targeted vulnerable men for robbery and murder, a woman whose claims of self-defense were transparent lies designed to escape accountability. For others, she was a victim of male violence who had finally fought back, a woman whose killings, while not legally justified, were morally understandable given the abuse she had suffered throughout her life. For still others, she was a complex figure who defied simple categorization, a person whose crimes were real and serious, but whose life story illustrated the ways in which society creates and discards its most vulnerable members. The feminist interpretation of Aileen Wuornos' case became particularly prominent in the years following her execution. Scholars and activists argued that Wuornos had been failed at every stage of her life by systems designed to protect her. Child Protective Services had not removed her from an abusive home. The juvenile justice system had not provided her with treatment or support. The adult criminal justice system had repeatedly arrested her for prostitution and petty crimes, while ignoring the violence she reported from clients. The mental health system had diagnosed her with serious disorders, but had never provided sustained treatment. And the legal system, in the end, had executed her for killing men who, in at least one confirmed case, had histories of sexual violence themselves. This interpretation was challenged by others who noted that Wuornos had robbed all of her victims, suggesting financial motivation rather than self-defense. They pointed to the multiple shots fired into each victim, the positioning of the bodies, the calm and methodical disposal of evidence, all of which suggested premeditation rather than panic. They noted that Wuornos herself had, at various points, admitted that some of the killings were not self-defense, that she had sometimes killed men who had not attacked her, that her self-defense narrative was a construction designed for legal consumption rather than a genuine account of events. The truth, as with most complex criminal cases, likely exists somewhere between these competing interpretations. Richard Mallory, the first victim, was almost certainly the kind of predator Wuornos described, a man with a documented history of sexual violence who had targeted prostitutes along the Florida highways for decades. It is entirely plausible that he attacked Wuornos, that she killed him in something resembling self-defense, and that this experience shaped her subsequent behavior along the highway. But the subsequent killings followed a different pattern. The victims were shot multiple times, often from behind or from angles inconsistent with close-quarters struggle. Their bodies were positioned in ways that suggested contempt rather than fear. Their property was taken and sold, and Wuornos continued to work the highways for more than a year after the first killing, placing herself in situations where she would encounter potential victims, suggesting that she was not merely defending herself, but actively hunting. The psychological explanation that best fits the evidence is one of escalation. Wuornos may have begun killing in genuine self-defense, responding to an attack by Richard Mallory with lethal force. But the experience of killing, of taking control of a situation where she had previously been powerless, may have fundamentally altered her psychology. Each subsequent encounter on the highway became, in her mind, a potential attack, a reenactment of the violence she had suffered throughout her life. Each man who picked her up was transformed, in her perception, into another predator, another abuser, another threat that required preemptive neutralization. This interpretation is consistent with the psychology of trauma and hypervigilance. Survivors of repeated violence often develop hair-trigger responses to perceived threats, responding with disproportionate force to situations that do not objectively warrant such responses. They may genuinely believe they are in danger when they are not, may interpret ambiguous cues as clear threats, may strike first because they have learned that waiting to be attacked means being victimized again, None of this justifies the killings. The 6 men who died after Richard Mallory included a construction worker, a rodeo hand, a sausage deliveryman, a retired merchant seaman, a concrete worker, and a security guard. They had families who mourned them, lives that were cut short, futures that never arrived. Whatever psychological processes led Aileen Wuornos to kill them, she was responsible for her actions, and the legal system was correct to hold her accountable. But understanding the psychology behind the crimes is essential to understanding their meaning, to learning whatever lessons can be learned from this tragedy. Aileen Wuornos was not born a killer. She was shaped into one by decades of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. The systems that were supposed to protect her failed at every turn, and by the time she encountered Richard Mallory on that highway in November 1989, she had been so thoroughly brutalized that killing had become the only response she knew. The highway that revealed Aileen Wuornos' secret was not merely a physical location, though the geography of I-75 and its surrounding corridors was certainly essential to the crimes. The highway was also a metaphor for the marginal existence that Wuornos had led since childhood, a life lived on the edges of society, moving from place to place without roots or stability, encountering strangers who wanted to use her body and discard her when they were finished. The interstate highway system, built in the 1950s and 1960s to connect American cities and enable interstate commerce, had by the 1980s become a shadow economy of its own, a network of truck stops and rest areas where illicit transactions occurred beyond the view of respectable society. Prostitution flourished along these corridors because truckers needed companionship and sex workers needed clients, because the highways offered anonymity and mobility, because law enforcement resources were spread thin across vast distances. Aileen Wuornos worked these highways for nearly 2 decades before she began killing. She was arrested repeatedly, served multiple sentences, and returned each time to the only life she knew. She was one of thousands of women who occupied this marginal space, trading their bodies for survival, enduring violence and exploitation as the cost of existence. Most of these women never killed anyone. Most of them simply endured, survived as best they could, and eventually disappeared into the endless churn of highway life. What made Aileen Wuornos different was not her circumstances, but her response to them. Somewhere along the line, she made a decision that most people in her position do not make. She decided to stop being a victim. She decided to fight back. And once she had killed once, the threshold for killing again became lower and lower until murder became simply another tool for survival. The investigation that eventually caught her was, in many ways, as revealing as the crimes themselves. Florida in 1990 was a patchwork of jurisdictions with limited coordination, a state where bodies could be found in multiple counties without anyone connecting the dots. The creation of the multi-agency task force that eventually identified Wuornos was a response to this fragmentation, an acknowledgement that serial crimes required coordinated investigation. But the task force's methods also raised troubling questions about the boundaries of ethical law enforcement. The use of Tyria Moore as an informant, pressuring her former lover into confessing through emotional manipulation, was legally permissible but ethically questionable. The failure to disclose Richard Mallory's criminal history to the defense was a clear violation of prosecutorial obligations. The rush to judgment, the desire to close the case and achieve convictions, may have prevented a fuller exploration of the circumstances that led to the killings. These procedural concerns were not sufficient to overturn Wuornos' convictions, and most observers agree that she was guilty of the murders. But they suggest that the legal system, in its eagerness to punish Wuornos for her crimes, may have failed to fully understand them. The media coverage of the Wuornos case both reflected and reinforced these limitations. From the moment of her arrest, Wuornos was presented as a monster, a damsel of death, or highway hooker, whose crimes were sensational precisely because she was a woman who killed men. The gender reversal, a female predator targeting male victims, fascinated the public in ways that male-on-female violence rarely did. Wuornos became an overnight celebrity, the subject of countless news stories, television specials, and eventually multiple feature films. The most notable of these was the 2003 film Monster, starring Charlize Theron in an Oscar-winning performance as Wuornos. The film attempted to humanize Wuornos, depicting her as a tragic figure driven to violence by abuse and desperation. It was praised for its nuanced portrayal of a complex individual and criticized for its sympathetic treatment of a convicted murderer. Either way, it ensured that Aileen Wuornos would remain a cultural figure long after her execution, a symbol whose meaning could be shaped and reshaped according to the needs of those invoking her name. The legacy of Aileen Wuornos continues to be debated by criminologists, psychologists, feminists, and true crime enthusiasts. Some see her as a cautionary tale about the consequences of untreated trauma and the failure of social systems to protect vulnerable children. Others see her as a symptom of the violence inherent in the sex trade, a woman who was brutalized by clients for years until she finally turned their violence back on them. Still, others see her as simply a criminal, a person who made choices for which she was justly punished, whose background and circumstances are relevant to understanding but not to excusing her crimes. The 7 men she killed remain largely forgotten in these debates, their names invoked briefly before attention returns to their killer. Richard Mallory, David Spears, Charles Carskadden, Peter Seams, Troy Burris, Charles Humphreys, Walter Gino Antonio. They were fathers, husbands, brothers, sons. They had families who loved them, lives that mattered, futures that were stolen. Whatever they may have done on the night they encountered Aileen Wuornos, they did not deserve to die. Their deaths were tragedies, not triumphs. But the tragedy extended beyond the 7 men and their families. It extended to the children that Aileen Wuornos never had the chance to raise, including the son she surrendered for adoption in 1971 and never saw again. It extended to Tyria Moore, who loved Wuornos despite everything and who testified against her to save herself. It extended to the countless women who continue to work the highways of Florida and other states, vulnerable to the same violence that shaped Wuornos's life, invisible until something terrible happens. The highway that revealed Aileen Wuornos's secret was I-75, the concrete ribbon that runs through the heart of Florida from Tampa to the Georgia border. But it was also every highway in America, every marginal space where desperate people do desperate things, every shadow where society deposits those it would rather not see. Aileen Wuornos emerged from these shadows for 13 months of killing, was captured, tried, condemned, and executed, and then receded again into the darkness from which she came. The highways remain. The truck stops remain. The women who work them remain. And the secrets that these highways reveal, the violence and exploitation that occur beyond the view of respectable society, continue to shape lives in ways that most Americans prefer not to contemplate. The story of Aileen Wuornos is not merely a true crime tale, though it contains all the elements of the genre. A dramatic arrest, a sensational trial, a death row confession, a lethal injection. It is also a social history, an exploration of the ways in which American society creates and destroys its most vulnerable members. It is a psychological study, an examination of how trauma can transform a victim into a perpetrator. And it is a meditation on justice, on the question of whether a society that fails to protect someone can fairly punish them for the consequences of that failure. These questions have no easy answers. Aileen Wuornos committed terrible crimes for which she was appropriately held accountable. But she was also the product of a society that abandoned her at every turn, that allowed her to be abused and exploited and brutalized until violence was the only language she knew. Both of these things are true simultaneously. Both of them must be acknowledged, if we are to learn anything from her life and death. The investigation into Aileen Wuornos' crimes revealed not only the identity of a serial killer, but also the conditions that created her. The pawn shop records and fingerprint databases that eventually linked her to the murders were the same systems that had tracked her through decades of petty crime without ever intervening to address the underlying causes of her behavior. The highway corridors where she hunted her victims were the same highways where she had been victimized herself, over and over, for nearly 20 years. The legal system that executed her was the same legal system that had failed to protect her as a child, that had repeatedly arrested her for prostitution while ignoring the violence she reported from clients. This is not to say that the legal system should not have convicted and punished Aileen Wuornos. It should have. She killed 7 people, and the families of those people deserved justice. But justice is not merely punishment. It is also understanding. It is the effort to comprehend why terrible things happen so that they might be prevented in the future. And the story of Aileen Wuornos, properly understood, is a story about prevention, about the interventions that were not made, the support that was not provided, the chances that were not given. Aileen Wuornos died on October 9th, 2002, at the age of 46, alone on a gurney in a Florida prison with chemicals flowing into her veins. She died as she had lived, in violence and isolation, without the love or connection she had always craved. She died believing that the world was against her, that everyone she had ever trusted had betrayed her, that she was destined for this ending from the moment of her birth. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps the patterns of abuse and neglect that shaped her childhood made her eventual trajectory inevitable, a bullet following its ballistic arc toward a predetermined target. Or perhaps there were moments when things could have been different, interventions that could have changed her course, choices that could have led her away from murder and towards something resembling a normal life. We will never know. What we know is the story that actually happened, the story of a woman who killed 7 men along the Florida highways, who claimed self-defense and was not believed, who was convicted and condemned and executed. We know the names of her victims and the manner of their deaths. We know the places where their bodies were found and the evidence that linked them to their killer. We know the legal proceedings that followed and the appeals that failed. What we do not fully know, and may never fully know, is who Aileen Wuornos really was beneath the labels that have been applied to her. Serial killer, victim, monster, survivor, madwoman, feminist icon. She has been called all of these things and more, and none of them captures the full complexity of a human being whose life was shaped by forces beyond her control, and whose choices, whatever their moral status, were in some sense responses to those forces. The highway revealed her secret, but it did not explain it. For that, we must look deeper, into the records of child welfare agencies and juvenile courts, into the psychology of trauma and the sociology of marginalization, into the economics of prostitution and the geography of interstate commerce. We must look at the society that produced Aileen Wuornos and ask what role we all played in creating the conditions that led to her crimes. This is not a comfortable exercise. It requires us to acknowledge that serial killers are not simply aberrations, monsters who emerge from nowhere and must be destroyed. They are products of systems, of failures, of choices made by individuals and institutions at every level of society. They are, in a sense, our collective creation, and we bear some responsibility for what they become. Aileen Wuornos understood this, even if she expressed it in paranoid and incoherent terms. She believed that the world was against her, that forces she could not see were manipulating her life toward predetermined ends. She was wrong about the specifics, about the radio waves and the sonic devices and the conspiracies. But she was right about the underlying reality. The world was against her, from the day she was born to the day she died. And while she was responsible for her choices, she did not choose the circumstances in which those choices were made. The final secret that the highway revealed was not merely the identity of a killer, but the identity of a society. A society that abandons its children. A society that criminalizes poverty and desperation. A society that consumes the bodies of its most vulnerable members and then expresses shock when some of them fight back. A society that executes people for crimes that it helped to create. This is the secret that Aileen Wuornos carried with her to the death chamber. The secret that her life and crimes exposed to anyone willing to look. It is not a comfortable secret. It is not a secret that leads to easy solutions or satisfying conclusions. But it is a secret that demands acknowledgement, that insists on being heard, that refuses to remain buried in the scrub palmetto along the I-75 corridor. The highway revealed Aileen Wuornos' secret. Now the question is what we will do with that knowledge. The physical evidence from the investigation has long since been archived, boxed, and labeled, and stored in climate-controlled facilities across Florida. The .22 caliber pistol that killed 7 men sits in an evidence locker somewhere. Its serial number partially restored through acid etching, its barrel still containing microscopic traces of gunpowder residue. The pawnshop slips and fingerprint cards have been digitized and uploaded to databases. The case files, running to thousands of pages, are available to researchers and journalists who wish to revisit the details of the investigation. But evidence alone does not tell a story. Evidence is merely raw material, data points that must be arranged and interpreted and narrated before they become meaningful. The story of Aileen Wuornos has been told many times, by prosecutors and defense attorneys, by journalists and filmmakers, by academics and true crime enthusiasts. Each telling emphasizes different elements, draws different conclusions, serves different purposes. This telling has attempted something different. It has attempted to situate the crimes within the larger context of Aileen Wuornos' life and the society that shaped her. It has attempted to understand without excusing, to explain without justifying, to hold multiple truths simultaneously. That she was a murderer and a victim, that she was responsible for her choices and constrained by her circumstances, that her execution was legally appropriate and morally troubling. Whether this attempt has succeeded is for you to judge. The facts are what they are. The interpretations remain contested, and the secrets that the highway revealed continue to whisper their uncomfortable truths to anyone willing to listen. Aileen Carol Wuornos was born on February 29, 1956, and died on October 9, 2002. She lived for 46 years, killed 7 men, and spent 11 of those years waiting to die. Her life was short, violent, and tragic. Her death was scheduled, witnessed, and documented. Her legacy is disputed, her meaning contested, her memory kept alive by true crime enthusiasts and feminist scholars and filmmakers and all the others who find in her story something worth examining. She is buried nowhere. Her ashes were scattered in Michigan, the state where she was born and abused and abandoned. The man who scattered them was a childhood friend who remembered her before she became famous, before she became a killer, before she became a symbol. He remembered her as a child, vulnerable and frightened and desperate for love. He scattered her ashes because she asked him to, because she wanted to return to the place where everything began. The highways of Florida continue to carry their endless traffic, trucks and cars and motorcycles flowing north and south, carrying people and goods between the cities and towns that line the interstate. The truck stops, where Aileen Wuornos worked, have changed ownership, been renovated, been torn down and rebuilt. The motels where she stayed have new names and new management. The bars where she drank have new patrons and new stories, but the margins remain. The spaces between the highway and the respectable world still exist, still harbor those who have been pushed out of the mainstream, still witness transactions and violence that rarely make the news. Other women work these margins now, as Aileen Wuornos once did. Some of them will be victimized, some of them will survive, some of them, perhaps, will reach breaking points of their own. The highway that revealed Aileen Wuornos' secret continues to reveal secrets, if we are willing to look. It reveals the precarity of life on the margins, the violence that the mainstream chooses not to see, the desperation that drives people to terrible choices. It reveals the failures of systems designed to protect the vulnerable, the ease with which society discards those it deems unworthy of attention. It reveals the deep inequalities of gender and class and circumstance that shape life outcomes in ways that are difficult to see from positions of privilege. These revelations are not comfortable. They demand something from us, some response beyond fascination and horror. They demand that we ask what kind of society we want to be, whether we are willing to invest in the systems that could prevent the next Aileen Wuornos, whether we are willing to see the vulnerable people in our midst before they become statistics in a true crime documentary. These are political questions, moral questions, questions that extend far beyond the specifics of one case from the 1990s. They are questions that this narrative cannot answer. But they are questions that this narrative can raise, can hold up for examination, can refuse to let fade into the comfortable distance of the past. The highway revealed Aileen Wuornos' secret. Her secret revealed something about America. And what that revelation means, what we do with that knowledge, remains an open question. A challenge that we must answer not with words, but with actions. The story is over. The questions remain. And somewhere along the I-75 corridor, the traffic continues to flow, carrying its secrets northward toward destinations unknown.